The race is on, and George Russell has finally put pen to paper on a new contract with Mercedes. But is everything as it seems with this new deal? And what does it mean for the future for Russell, Mercedes, and the F1 driver market as a whole? I'm Glenn Freeman, and joining me for this emergency opening segment is Jon Noble. Welcome to the Race F1 podcast. And if you're wondering where Edd Straw is, don't worry, you'll be hearing from him very shortly on the rest of this episode. Full disclosure to everybody watching and listening, we did already have a full podcast episode recorded and ready to go when Edd stepped on his plane to Austin. But then we got word that Mercedes were going to be announcing George Russell's renewal, and Kimi Antonelli's, to be fair. So I've stepped into Edd's shoes to guest host this hastily recorded opening segment so we can react to that news. I will be throwing back to our original podcast recording shortly. But firstly, Jon, I have to ask, I thought it was your thing to be on a plane when F1 announcements get made.
Yeah, this is quite unusual. Normally I switch the phone off as you go into airplane mode and take off. When I land, the WhatsApp messages and emails are full of driver announcements. So for once, I was amazingly not on a plane, and B, unlike many people who've gone to Austin, on air this weekend, awake. So a lot of this was happening very early on in American time, but I've been up. I've been out, and I think it's a new one as well for the races on to be said by someone other than Edd, isn't it?
Yeah, so Edd's kind of jumped on your territory by being the man on a plane when the news comes, and I've been able to jump into Edd's territory. I believe that is only the second time someone other than Edd in the 4-5 and a bit year history of the Race F1 podcast that someone else has said the race is on. I won't make people guess when the last one was, but there was one. It was back in 2020. Scott Mitchell-Malm hosted an episode, and I doubt Edd was very happy about that. He's probably not very happy about this as well. He hates missing news, and he certainly hates not being able to host his beloved podcast. But he'll be back shortly in this very episode. We're still going to give you the full episode that was recorded before he went away. But Jon, let's talk Russell and Mercedes for a bit before we do that. We've been waiting for a long time, really, for this news. We finally got the confirmation that we've been longing for through the summer months. A deal's done. So can we now safely say that Russell and Mercedes are locked together long term?
Depends on your definition of long term.
More than 2026.
Well, in theory, yes. From what we understand, and it was quite I'd say curious way that Mercedes announced it today. They didn't actually announce new contracts that had been signed. All they did was issue a press release saying this is our 2026 driver lineup. Now, for that to have happened, contracts had to have been signed, but there's no reference at all to the lengths of the contracts. So we did a bit of digging, and from what we understand, and I think George Russell's the main interest here because his future's been a bit more kind of open than Kimi Antonelli, who seems very much part of Mercedes for the long term. But George's contract is multi-year, so that, from what I understand, doesn't mean it's a 1+1 as often happens in these occasions. It is in for 27, but this is Formula One. Circumstances change. Nothing can be guaranteed, I think, for 27, primarily because next year's rules are so different. There's going to be such a shake-up of the grid that I think the whole picture of F1 could alter, and we could have no end of a driver market silly season that rips everything up and leaves us something completely unexpected.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that's the case, and we will come back to that element in a minute in a bit more detail. But as I mentioned there, we've been waiting for this announcement for so long, and do we have any indication of what took so long? Because once Max Verstappen was locked back in at Red Bull because his various options that could have got him out were no longer on the table, that was before the summer break, wasn't it? Russell and Mercedes felt like an inevitability. So what was the hold-up?
Yeah, I think that the hold-up early on in the season was the Max Verstappen factor, because I think Mercedes needed to be not necessarily convinced he wasn't going there for 26. I think that was never really on the table. But I think wanted clarity about his future, what his mindset was, what the approach was long-term before they could settle on what they were doing. So that took us up to the summer break before Max locked himself in, and that issue is now off the table for the next 12 months. Then it became a case, I think, pretty much that George and Mercedes were going to stay together. I think there was never any doubt on that. And when that doubt isn't there, there's never a rush to get the contract done. No one was going to pinch George Russell away. George was going to lose his seat because someone else was going to come knocking on the door and steal it from under his toes. So I think they just found time to do it. They wanted to get the details right. And Toto Wolff made reference to this. It was important to get it done in the right way where everybody was happy. So I think it was just finalising, tiny elements like sponsorship, appearances, driver days, travel, all those sort of elements. But I think the big picture stuff was agreed quite a while ago. But it's always the small details that seem inconsequential. It may seem like, why is a contract being held up for this? But actually, these are the quite important elements that if someone's unhappy, they can overshadow, the proper elements that we think are important.
So as usual in these situations, it's the boring bits that are creating the hold up. The simple fact of, we want you to drive for us next year. Would you like to drive for us next year? Yes, I would. That's kind of the easy bit, even though that's the bit we're most interested in. I thought it was interesting what you said about the announcement being curious in some ways. And I know that thanks to your advantage of not being on an aeroplane, you've had to dig into why it was announced the way it was. And I'm always of the belief that once something is in press release form, nothing in that press release is there or is missing by accident. But I think that brings us on to what you hinted at already, Jon, which is the 2027 element of this. This isn't something that we should make out as a Mercedes and George Russell specific issue. I think that would be unfair, because surely anyone who's got a stake in the F1 driver market knows that what goes on track in 2026 with this massive rule change coming in, we've got the potential for fireworks basically all over the grid, haven't we?
Yeah, the whole thing could explode spectacularly, and it could happen as soon as the Bahrain test. If we get one of the top drivers, especially Max Verstappen, who we know has got an exit clause, who we know needs to be in the top two of the Drivers' Championship by the summer break to be locked in at Red Bull for 27. If he's available, I think there's very few teams that would say, oh, no, we're not interested because we've got drivers under contract. These are the days where the lawyers come out, people are looking at contracts, people are looking at other options. What can they do? Can we do a deal? What needs to be done? So I think we will be in a scenario where I can see a top team next year underperforming, their top driver wanting to look elsewhere, and a team potentially that's got vacancies that no one's looking at the moment is very quick, has people knocking on their door, and all the dominoes fall out from there. So things appear calm at the moment, but everyone's in a holding pattern, and this holding pattern is going to end. Maybe Bahrain, more likely Melbourne, but definitely 2 or 3 races into the season, when we get the full picture, we know that there will be a seat that is the dream seat for anyone for 2027, and there's going to be a big fight to get in that.
And no matter what contract anybody has in their back pocket, all of these contracts have ways to get out of them. Again, coming back to the reason for contracts being delayed is the boring bits. Some of those boring bits are exit clauses, and they're not always as straightforward as, okay, if you're not second in the championship, you can leave. So it would be wrong to look at any list of who's under contract until when and assume really that anybody will be unable to move for 27. As you said, the lawyers get involved. Very skilled people get involved in doing this. It's not a driver going to a team boss and saying, your car's a bit rubbish, I'm going to go and sign for these guys. It's far more serious, professional, and legal than that. So is it fair to say that we should consider pretty much everybody could be on the market if their team has a bad start to 26?
I think so. I think it depends on the level of underperformance for some. I think if you're in a kind of respectable bandwidth, then that may be rescuable. But if you're a Red Bull team, if you're a Ferrari, if you're Mercedes, if you're McLaren, and you're off the back of the grid, 3 seconds adrift, no hope of any moving forward, your drivers aren't going to want to stick around. So I think that's the scenario we're in. Next season may be more normal than we anticipate, but there is potential for some drama, potential for surprises. And when it comes to contracts, especially in Formula One, and as we saw this with Sergio Perez, for example, deals are always there. There's a price on every single contract. And what we think is confirmed and 100% today isn't necessarily the case tomorrow.
Totally agree. Contracts are there to be broken. We have case studies of this. I'm always reminded of late 2014 when suddenly Sebastian Vettel leaves Red Bull and Fernando Alonso leaves Ferrari. I know you were heavily involved actually in breaking those stories. We didn't see those coming at the time, but I think they're an excellent reminder that really anything can happen in the F1 driver market, particularly after a big rules shake-up. But we'll leave the Russell Mercedes driver market chat there for now. There's going to be plenty more to come on this story as everyone gets to Austin. I'm sure you'll hear more about this from Edd Straw and Scott Mitchell-Malm. They're going to be in Austin. They'll be debriefing what they find out in the paddock in the Race Members Club in our In-Car Insights features. When they'll be driving back from the track, they'll have a chat about what they found out, I guess, both on and off the record. So that's going to be very interesting. Go and check out the Members Club if you want to find out what we find out next about this story. For now, though, I will hand back over to the safe hands of Ed to take this podcast back in control of the Race F1 podcast, as he always likes to be. He'll be joined by Ben Anderson and by Jon, who's now got to hop back in time to join that podcast. And they're going to be discussing first the drama that's going on between McLaren and IndyCar champion Alex Palou.
Let's catch up on the legal case that's currently being heard in the UK's commercial court, brought by McLaren against Alex Palou. Now, this is all related to the deal that Palou signed with McLaren to race in IndyCar for the 2023 season while under contract for Chip Ganassi Racing. And of course, that contract had F1 opportunities and the possibility even that it may down the line lead to an F1 seat. He subsequently reneged on that deal, and that's what this case is all about, with McLaren claiming for lost profit. It's an ongoing case, obviously, so we don't have a resolution yet, and not all the evidence is out there, but what have we learned so far?
The basic outline of the case had been quite well known, well documented in public before, that Alex had signed this McLaren IndyCar contract. He'd reneged on it and had gone to court, and McLaren seeking its damages. But what's always interesting in these cases, it was interesting when this Oscar Piastri CRB hearing came up a few years ago, is all the details and the kind of the behind the scenes negotiations and contracts and discussions and meetings. And I think this is what's interesting about the case. And it also, I think the way it intertwines with Piastri's status at the team, the way that McLaren got him out of the Alpine contract. At the time, Alex was looking to come to Formula One as well. And that these are the details that have come up in court, that that famous tweet that Oscar did Alpine the day Alpine announced him, and then he did this tweet saying, "I'm not racing for them. I'm as far as I'm concerned, I'm not an Alpine driver next year." And this is how Alex found out about Oscar's future. He realised the F1 door was shut, realised he needed to do something else for IndyCar. So it's all these kind of the details and discussions and elements that I find all fascinating in these cases.
Yeah, it always reveals a lot just about the mechanics of how these things work, if nothing else, just of general interest. There's little details in there, like the fact Palou had two contracts with McLaren, for that there was the one that was the driving one and the marketing one. Just little things like that people don't often hear about, the complexities within it, just in general terms. But it's an interesting case, Ben, isn't it? Because there's $20 million lost profits McLaren are claiming, which again just showcases the potential value and cost to a team of a driver who's no longer driving with them, because that's all related to opportunities he was given that McLaren say, well, this cost money, whereas obviously Palou's making the argument that he feels that the F1 opportunity was overplayed, etc., etc. So there's lots of those little things in there that tell you about how these deals are done.
Yes, there's a lot at stake in that sense. You might think that $20 million isn't really much than small change to an F1 team, but they're big, hungry financial entities, aren't they? So the more you can get, the more you'll take. And it does seem that in this particular case, obviously that sponsorship revenue is tied up to IndyCar. It feels like there's been a kind of fundamental misunderstanding between Palou and Zak Brown. It seems like Zak Brown wanted him as the preeminent IndyCar driver of the moment for his IndyCar team primarily, and they did a deal that it's disputed whether it's connected to Palou or not. He claims not, but McLaren seem to think that they signed NTT, the title sponsor, on the basis of having Palou, and therefore Palou not racing for them in IndyCar is massively costly because they had to renegotiate that deal. So they're trying to claim that money back principally. That's the bulk of that $20 million. And then there's a little bit more in terms of, well, we had to pay other drivers, presumably the existing ones more, and then Palou's replacement in the IndyCar team. So it all kind of adds up. But Palou suggests that he was totally focused on F1, and it was like, okay, well, I might do some IndyCar, but I want to go to F1. And Zach Brown's position is, well, I want you for IndyCar and I'm signing sponsors on that basis. But yeah, I'd quite like you to go into F1 if we have an opening. But as you mentioned, the Piastri curveball kind of blew the whole thing up. And the fact they weren't able to kind of come to an agreement outside of court is probably regrettable from both of their perspectives, because this is the kind of thing you really want to settle behind closed doors, so you don't have to reveal all the different machinations of how you do business and how you negotiate contracts and what the details are. But court is the best place to find out all these juicy details, because they have to be revealed as part of the case.
Yeah, very much so. And people have seen a lot of stories about this. I would say whenever you're dealing with any court case, it's always important in the reporting to see what, because things are stated as absolutes when cases are being built, but there's two sides in every case. So you've always got to understand whose case is being reported and what the other side says and what the kind of court's resolution is. That's still an ongoing process. But what's the heart of it, John, isn't it, is how serious McLaren were about F1 for Palou. The evidence is that there were certainly options for a possible pathway to F1 in this contract, and it all hinges on kind of how likely they were to be used. Something like that seems to be what Palou has claimed.
Yeah, I think like every Formula One team, you've got no guarantee that any driver, even your current drivers, will perform. They could get snatched by other teams. You've got youngsters coming up. If any team was convinced about any driver, big teams wouldn't have tons and tons of youngsters coming through the ranks trying to work out who's best, who's not. You need lots of options. You need to go where things are at. And maybe from McLaren's perspective, signing Piastri for 23, it may not have turned out to be great. Oscar may not have delivered. They may have felt that Palou was a better option for the long term. So, it's an option. You can never be definitive. And situations change. Oscar was brilliant. He's continued to be brilliant. He's now leading the World Championship. So a door's shut. This is what happens in Formula One. It's all about timing. Teams like lots of options. And unfortunately, they can close down options that drivers have big dreams and big ambitions and big hopes of taking. These things don't often align.
Yeah, I think the timing point is really astute, because in the evidence presented so far, Palou's basically saying, well, I started having conversations with Zach Brown at kind of the end of 2021 into 2022. And at that point, McLaren have got Norris and Ricciardo. So the timeline kind of looks like, well, Ricciardo's not really doing what we thought he would do. You'll probably be the guy we go to replace him with. And then at the same time, according to the evidence so far, Andreas Seidel, former team principal, is doing his own thing in courting Piastri, because they think, presumably from the F1 side, he's the best option available. And then you get this kind of inflection of Piastri becoming, surprisingly available, McLaren swooping at least one part of McLaren. And of course, the stuff that Zach's been supposedly saying to Palou before that becomes outdated, because it's like, well, we're getting rid of Ricciardo earlier than planned. We've got this other driver that we think is going to be good. He might not work out, so I'll adjust my plan and make you a contingency. But that probably doesn't align with the first conversations he had when the whole Piastri thing wasn't on the table. So the sands shift constantly over such a long timeline, and then you just end up with more and more misunderstandings, which unfortunately they haven't been able to resolve amicably, it seems.
Well, let's also not forget that the Piastri situation went to the Contracts Recognition Board. So there was a chance that McLaren has a vision of what it wants to happen. The lawyers don't agree with that vision, and there is a parallel universe somewhere where Oscar Piastri is in an Alpine right now.
Oh, no.
Quite disappointed and probably not leading the World Championship.
It does shine a light on the fact that there's so many of these things. It's like when you hear about the past and drivers say, oh, I had a contract with this team for that. And it's okay. Well, you have a contract for something, but exactly what is it? Is it options? Is it a possible future thing? And, any time you sign a driver who is going to do some F1 work, there will very often be some kind of mechanism for if they're going to be a race driver. Sometimes if that opportunity comes, they do a new deal because that works for both sides. I know in the case of Colapinto with Williams last year, they did a fresh deal because they wanted to tie him down for longer, having given him the opportunity. And then they've got an asset that they can sell, or a driver they've got the contract for a long time. So again, it's just all those little details that come up, and it's why, teams and drivers don't really like this sort of thing coming to court if they possibly can. And it's an ongoing one. But I guess it's just a reminder, though, isn't it, Ben, that Palou is a little bit of a loss to Formula One. I mean, setting aside this case, he's 28 now. He's clearly a phenomenally able driver, and he's done very well in IndyCar. He is the man in IndyCar and could continue to be the man in IndyCar for a decade or more. Who knows how many wins and championships he's going to rack up. But what is clear from his evidence is he was like laser focused on F1, and this case is irrelevant because the ship has sailed. But it's a shame he's never going to get to F1 in any circumstances.
Yeah, it does seem
almost certainly, I should say.
Yeah, you can never say never, but it does seem like that door is closed now. He's on a kind of Verstappen type tear in IndyCar, isn't he? 4 out of the last 5 championships, and he is the outstanding guy. I had a feeling that Zak Brown was quite keen on, and maybe this is at the heart of it originally, kind of unifying a bit more the IndyCar and F1 worlds. Obviously, it's not a new thing for an IndyCar driver to make the transition, but it doesn't happen very often, and it doesn't go very well often when it does. Maybe Palou is going to break the mold, but as you say, 28 now, that's probably still young enough if you really wanted to take a punt, but I can't see which teams would. I think from what we've seen so far of the court case, he was minded to try and get into Red Bull. Obviously, they were flirting with Colton Herta at one point a few years ago, and apparently Palou had conversations with Helmut Marko, but then he claims Zak Brown and Marko had a chat, which he doesn't know about, and that shut things down. It's hard to see how, especially given that Palou's not only had contractual problems with McLaren over this specific thing, but also with Chip Ganassi and his continuing to race in IndyCar and then dalliance with McLaren and back to Chip Ganassi. It seems like dealing with his management is not particularly easy if you're a racing organisation. So F1 teams, even if they were still looking at Palou, they'd be wary of getting into some kind of situation like McLaren's going through now. But in terms of anyone else coming out of IndyCar, I can't really see it. He's the kind of best fit in terms of success and age profile. Surprised to me because he did okay on the kind of European rung, didn't he? He did quite well in F3, and I think did do some racing in Japan after that. But he didn't really look like F1 material nailed on, and then has just gone and had this amazing career in IndyCar. It would have been really interesting to see him make the transition. I think it's a shame that these circumstances have robbed us of the chance to see him make that leap, because he had that one test, I think it was 2022 at Austin. He did the free practice session for McLaren when relations were less frosty, and he looked quite good. So it would have been fun to see him build on that and then help us judge kind of the actual level between IndyCar and F1, which Zak Brown seemed to think was quite close. I think now we'll never get to see that, which is a shame.
Yeah, and this case is very much ongoing, so keep an eye on it. There'll obviously be a verdict eventually, and that will kind of tell you a little bit about who has done what in this case, because at the moment it's claims and evidence and counterclaims, etc., etc. So yeah, lots of interesting details, and yeah, a glance behind the curtain of the complexity of these things, and a reminder that anytime you hear somebody signed a contract, the key question is what actually is in that contract and what are the discussions around it. Let's move to on-track matters now, Ben, and have a look ahead to Austin. To me, very much a modern classic, by far and away the best of the 3 events in the United States. But where do you stand on it?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's a great circuit, really fun one to go to. It's almost the sort of realised F1 dream track, isn't it? I know they tried to kind of create some of the best sectors from around the calendar at the time. Obviously, it's one of the more veteran venues now. When did it have its first race? Was it 2012 or was it before that? I think it was 2012.
No, it's 2012. I remember standing up by turn 1 in the freezing cold to watch the first car go out in practice, and it's an uphill pit lane, and because the tyres were freezing and it was so cold, I remember Kimi Räikkönen, I think, was the first to go out, and he just sort of wheel spinning because he could barely get the car launched from having stopped it going up the hill because it was so freezing. But yeah, I remember I did the sort of the first half of the lap in FP1 and the second half of the lap in FP2, and from that first day, I've really loved it.
Well, maybe if Pirelli ever gets its tyre blanket ban over the line, then we will see those scenes replicated from the first FP1 session. But yeah, really, really fun track. to see F1 cars do their thing with that really high-speed first sector, and then the more kind of traction-limited straight line middle sector, and then something a bit more between the two, medium speed at the end. Very challenging, pretty high degradation as well, so that usually makes for kind of more interesting strategic races than we've become used to. So one of the modern classics, I would say, and a great way to kind of kick off this final leg of the championship.
It's interesting, John, isn't it? Because it's an example of a circuit that we're not seeing made so much anymore, because it's a modern track in terms of the design and the timeline and everything. But they did the work, build. I mean, that hill up to turn one, it wasn't there. They have made that as part of the design of the track, and because we see so many street circuits now, there's not many opportunities to do this. I guess Qiddiya in Saudi Arabia is the next chance to do that. But it's an example of what you can do within modern circuit design bounds to come up with a really interesting and popular circuit. It's not one that drivers generally cite as their favourite, but I'd be very surprised if you asked drivers to rank all the tracks in F1 if it wouldn't be in pretty much everyone's top half dozen, say.
Yeah, it's complete proof that elevation makes a great racetrack, both from a visual perspective and a challenge. Turn 1 there is iconic. Probably, stands out in our own eyesight, like Eau Rouge at Spa, for example. It's that steep, it's that good. If Eau Rouge was flat, completely flat, then I think it would be a really boring corner with no one will film. This is why on earth are they bothered with this tiny little kink on a straight that does nothing? So elevation makes an awful lot of difference. And Austin does work. They may well have stolen ideas from other venues. The Silverstone Beckett's complex for the opening sector. Some of I think some of the stadium sections at the end were mirrored on Hockenheim and all those elements. But everything works and comes together, and it means that no car is kind of utterly dominant in all sectors. You've got to kind of pick where you want to pitch it. It makes it quite open. It makes it a challenge for the tyres. And it's pretty good racing, and that the chicane or that kind of left-right complex at the end of the back straight, always a place of controversy and incidents and drama, as it was last year, and I'm sure it will be again this year.
Plus, it's one of those tracks where you never really know what kind of conditions you can get. I've been there when it's been hot, when it's been freezing, when it's been raining, like the end of times, basically. So that's what you get there. Now, one of the interesting things this weekend, Ben, is that it's the return of the Pirelli tyre gap. C1, C3 and C4 are the 3 tyres. So that didn't work especially well last time it was tried, but it's an interesting idea if the tyres behave as you want them to. But again, we're in the realms, aren't we, if they've got a small number of tyre compounds to cover the whole year. So it's always very difficult to do that gap without rendering one end or the other useless.
Yeah, I have reservations about this. They tried it at Spa. As you say, it didn't work. But obviously the weather famously intervenes at Spa. Also a sprint weekend. So the tyre allocation is weird because you're mandated to use certain tyres at certain points. And you have fewer freedoms in terms of what you do because there isn't the same number of practice sessions. Same format for Austin. It's a sprint, right? I think so. You kind of don't get a new test of this. The weather will probably be better. I know you said that you can get all kinds, but I think at the moment the forecast is for it to be quite hot. That's probably good.
I was just having glanced, very, very hot actually.
Yeah, so that'd be helpful in terms of making the tyres melt and work harder. So that might play to this having this step. But I think the problem is sort of twofold. One, the teams are so good at managing the tyres now. Not perfect, but everyone's put so much effort into this that it's difficult for Pirelli to kind of do anything when, as you say, they have to make a set that can work across all the tracks to really pull any levers that can bamboozle the teams in the way they used to. And also the 2 softer compounds are the same, broadly the same. I know that it's slightly different every year, but they're the same number in the range as they used last year. So it's not, I think you kind of needed to have almost a bigger step. You might wanted to go 2. So you have kind of a hard at one extreme end and then a much softer qualifying tyre just to make it more difficult to kind of find the balance in the middle. Really, you've got what the teams were used to last year in terms of soft and medium, and then you've just got a harder hard. So that's the main difference. And I don't really feel like it's nice to say that they're trying to do something to change the strategy, but I don't think it will do an awful lot. I think broadly people will do what they usually do, which is try to have an option to use each tyre in the race if they can. And if your qualifying goes wrong and you need to start near the back, you're going to stick on the hard. And the fact it's just one step harder than the one you used last year doesn't really make any odds, because your strategy is basically to go as long as you can, isn't it? So, and from the opposite side, if you decide that you need to pit early and then stick on that hard, again, it's the same thing. It's just a more durable tyre. So I don't really feel like it's going to be the game changer that they hope it will be. We've seen Pirelli try things like, mandating 2 stops at Monaco. That did make a difference, but maybe not the one they intended. All this idea of trying to engineer 2 stops in different ways, it just hasn't worked, because I think the teams are too good in their understanding of their tyres, and probably at this point too good in terms of their understanding of their own cars as well.
It is a sprint weekend as well, John, so that'll make the SAR challenge potentially a little bit more. But then again, you could have said the same thing about Spa, and it didn't quite work. So how do you see that feeding into it? Do you think this one at least might be a fairer judge of this kind of gap strategy? Because there were some specific reasons at Spa why that didn't quite work, maybe as it could have done.
Yeah, Pirelli see this as the first proper test of this idea. And this is something I think Andrew Shovlin mentioned. I can't remember which race it was. A couple of races ago, we were discussing the tyre strategies, and Pirelli had done so much in pushing things softer. But as Ben says, the teams are now so good at tyres, they perfectly know how to get life out and manage the softer tyres. But what perhaps is a different world for them is if the hard tyre is slow and a big delta chunk slower than the medium, then it's very difficult to make a slow tyre fast. There's a kind of certain physical limit that tyre can get to. So in the ideal scenario, you want that hard to be really, really slow but really durable. And then that opens the door for the 1-stop versus 2-stop. So if we can get into a world where the hard will last the race, it's an easy 1-stop, it isn't quick, and then people are charging and attacking on mediums or even the softs, then the prospect is there. But it will need a clear okay from the weather front, which looks all right. It looks super hot, perfect temperature for you, Ed, by the looks of it, to do your sunbathing. And then we'll see how it shake out. And then because of the sprint weekend, you're also further limited on tyres a little bit as well. So it'll be interesting to see how teams plot their way through all this.
Now, Ben, last year at Austin, there was obviously the bit of controversy with Verstappen and Norris, among others. Interestingly, it was a track where Norris was a clear step ahead of Oscar Piastri. Now, Piastri was in his later season, slightly fallow period at this stage. Do you think Norris can take any hope from that? Or do you think he'll just look at the fact that pretty much every track where Piastri struggled last year, he's been great this year? And that's probably going to continue.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it there. It's pretty much clean slate this year, isn't it? Every time we go to a track and there weren't that many of them, but there were probably half a dozen where you go, Piastri is a little bit off it compared to the normal level. That's not been the case this year. He won in China, he won in Spain, he had Norris under pressure when he was allowed to in Austria. He won Zandvoort. I know it was close there, but that was a proper Norris dominant race last year. Singapore, he was ahead in qualifying and obviously chased him home after the turn 1 contretemps. So I feel like the pattern is everywhere that Piastri's been weak, he's found a solution, a clear one. It's not like he's just edged a little bit closer to Norris. He's been ahead, or sometimes emphatically ahead. So partly that's a consequence of the car and different characteristics this year, which maybe favour Piastri a bit more. Also, it's the work he has done. He's very diligent, methodical, technical. You can see that, evidence clearly in how he's progressed. So I feel like every track we go to now, Piastri's got a chance, as good a chance as Norris, of winning. And it's going to come down, setting aside McLaren's interventions and methods of balancing the scales of justice, just in terms of their competitive battle, it's tiny margins, isn't it? Absolutely tiny margins. And I imagine it will be the same in Austin.
The big question, John, is what other teams can get involved. It's interesting because McLaren have played down how well they will go in Austin. So have Red Bull. Everybody's been playing it down. We're coming off a weekend in Singapore where Mercedes was able to win from pole unexpectedly. So what do you think is going to emerge as the competitive picture? Does that all add up to something that could be actually very, very close and could just come down to execution? Or if you had to choose one car you were going to jump in and have your best chance of winning based on what you know now, which would it be?
Yes, it's intriguing because you think on paper it's a great McLaren track, different variations of corners, lots of medium speed areas, cars being quick pretty much everywhere. But then Andrea Stella, whether he's getting super cautious and wanting to keep the kind of pressure on the team to improve or not, has played it down, saying they're going to struggle in the low speed stuff. There are some high speed elements where the Red Bull will excel. And then we see Mercedes change. I think what will be interesting and what may become a talking point is whether the Mercedes and Red Bull changes they've made to their front wings, which appear to have brought in a little bit of the return of flex, which gives them a bit of a better balance window, whether that has unlocked something in those two cars where there are tiny margins now and the gaps are small. But if the drivers are more comfortable with the balance, if they feel they can attack, that gives us an exponential return in terms of lap time and performance, especially in the race. So I'd be interested to see if that continues in Austin. It'll be interesting then to see if it becomes a political issue, whether Ferrari or McLaren start going, actually, we think these wings aren't correct and something needs to be done. And then there's also that trend that Red Bull seems to have made a step. It's been on a bounce now of beating McLaren on pace terms. Even Singapore, when Max had those tremendous struggles in the race with a car that he wasn't comfortable with, still managed to finish ahead of the McLarens. So I think it's all shaking up to look pretty good. I think the only team probably not going to be at the front is Ferrari because it's a bumpy track. So your ride height's got to come up. We know how sensitive that car is. That car's nowhere near as strong as last year, and I think it's going through a pretty difficult patch at the moment where things just don't seem to be clicking. And we see that now with the way that Charles Leclerc's not frustrated. I just think he's kind of checked out of the season in terms of just thinking that no matter what I do, I can't get this car to the front of the grid.
Yeah, that hope of a victory in the second half of the season, I think, is as far away as ever. Really, the Ferrari just doesn't look right. I think they've missed a trick on this front wing flex that Jon mentioned. That it kind of makes sense now when you think about the step Red Bull made and Verstappen pushing to have more front wing on the car. They've obviously found a better balance with that car. I think what you'll have in Austin probably, unlike last year when Ferrari were in the mix and obviously won in the wake of Norris and Verstappen going into each other. Sainz won the sprint as well, didn't he? I think, if I remember rightly. They were just getting into flexing properly, and they made a big step, and they were very competitive in this phase of the season. I don't see that happening this year. They've switched off development. They've missed this opportunity to kind of claw back some of the flexibility, if that's what's been happening. So that car is kind of a little bit adrift. I imagine the Mercedes, even though it was better and particularly strong at Singapore, I'm not sure a track like Austin, where the surface is so much more abrasive and the degradation different to what you get at Singapore, I imagine they'll be more competitive just from the balance. Maybe they won't have both cars in the gravel, but I can see them kind of maybe being third best ahead of Ferrari. If Ferrari, if their problems continue, I imagine it's going to be Red Bull versus McLaren, and Red Bull with that front wing, Verstappen in particularly, more competitive. So I think maybe a bit more like the pattern we've seen recently, where it's McLaren's a kind of nominally favourite, especially because of that ability to look after the rear tyres, but Verstappen just in the mix, causing a massive nuisance for Piastri and Norris.
Yeah, and of course, it'll be an easier track for McLaren if, say, they don't have the pace quite to take pole than it was in Singapore, because Singapore's basically your second hardest track to pass that. Circuit of the Americas is a very different proposition, so it could be one where even if you're behind in qualifying, it might be a little bit easier in races. But then again, suggesting it's in any way easy to get ahead and gain track position if Max Verstappen's involved, given how good he is, that's pretty difficult. So we've got this hope, I guess, that the championship battle will be more complicated than just which McLaren's faster in qualifying, as it often has been. It's been really, really close, but it's kind of usually been lap one and qualifying that decides it, unless there's been a little bit of controversy along the way. And of course, if you want to hear about some of the controversy, we did a whole podcast on papaya rules and what the motivation is and what's really going on, what they should be last time. So McLaren will be hoping that's not a topic that comes up this weekend. Jon, let's move now into the world of politics, because there's been a lot of talk about the FIA elections that are going to be held in December, and now the likelihood that Mohammed Ben Sulayem will run unopposed, despite there being several candidates who have thrown their hats into the ring. So what exactly is the situation?
Yeah, this is an intriguing one that's, I think, one that's exposed kind of some of the downsides of changes made to the electoral rules. In terms of any candidate that wants to stand as FI president needs to pull together what's known as a presidential list. So it's a list of 10 people that go on the ticket with you, get them tick off certain criteria, and you go forward to the election. The problem is one of the criteria for your presidential list is to have these members of the World Motorsport Council, which have to come from different regions, which you think, oh, that's great, because then that ensures some diversity and it's all great. Except one of the regions is South America, and it emerged last week that the list of eligible candidates from South America that the presidential hopefuls can pick from, there's only one candidate from South America, who is Fabiano Ecclestone from Brazil, who's on Mohammed Ben Sulayem's ticket. And because the electoral rules don't allow you to stand on more than one presidential list, that basically means nobody else can fulfil the requirements to put their presidential list in by October the 24th. So as things stand, no one else can stand against Mohammed Ben Sulayem. So it means after October 24th, there will be no kind of formal battle. I think there still has to be a vote to confirm his presidency at the vote in December. But the battle's over. It falls over on a technicality, and a lot of kind of unhappy people hoping to, at least take the battle to a vote with Ben Sulayem, just feeling that the rules have been rigged against them.
Yeah, you have to say, Ben, that regardless of what your opinion is of those involved, having an election system that effectively doesn't function because you've created rules that mean you can have a part of the world, you've got to have someone on your presidential list from, and there's only one person, effectively means that person is just the kingmaker, doesn't it?
Yeah,
so that's a problem in any electoral process.
Yeah, it certainly is. But I mean, normally the kingmakers are like a whole state or a couple of states or, like a few regions, not one person, like the only person. So that just seems like a fundamental flaw in the democratic process. But I mean, maybe the FIA is not that interested at the moment in having a proper democratic process. I remember when we talked about this election, well, can we even call it an election now? I think it's more likely to be a confirmation. But John, you were saying that it's incredibly difficult anyway to run against an incumbent president. It doesn't happen very often. So it was always maybe a bit of a long shot, but it felt like there were, candidates emerging that it might be quite interesting. We talked about it needing to be a 2-horse race because of other rules. And then a third horse appeared as well. And now it seems like there were going to be no horses in the race, just one proud stallion continuing to rule with their iron hoof. So, yeah, strange. I find it bizarre that it could come down to basically one individual in one region. Unfortunately, it's in South America too, which obviously has a long and proud history of fair and free elections and democratic processes. So, yeah, a kind of ridiculous situation, I think.
I think it's exposed a flaw in the system, and this is one of an unintended consequence of a rule that you can argue it brings diversity and it brings the chance to have lots of input from all around the world to get people onto the World Motorsport Council, but actually you end up with this small group of people ultimately deciding the elections. I think there were 6, from what I understand, 6 potential clubs within South America could have put candidates forward. Only one candidate was accepted. So to win an election isn't about the hundreds of other clubs all around the world. The election can be decided by 6 clubs in South America, which to me doesn't seem a very satisfactory way of holding an election and getting everyone's kind of input and feedback and ability to challenge. Because I think it's healthy for any organisation to have people challenging and speak about visions for the future and what's been done, what hasn't been done, what needs to change. Because if the electoral rules don't allow anyone to stand against you, then it doesn't seem a very good democratic process.
It reminds me a little bit of the Conservative Party leadership contest when they had a sequence of prime ministers. Obviously, they had internal contests to decide who became leader and effectively prime minister of the UK. But it felt like the same denial of democratic due process, whereby basically a small number of people who were paid up members of this party could choose who the prime minister was going to be, rather than the general electorate having the opportunity to vote on a different person to the one who'd been leading them when there was a general election. So, even in well-established, long-held democracies, there are these quirks of process that can end up kind of reducing the process down to something that is actually, I think, quite unsatisfactory.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't look good to the wider world, whatever happens. And we should say that there are reasons, as John says, it ensures there's input from around the world. We should remember as well, the FIA, it's not just motorsport, it's mobility. And in fact, it's more mobility than it is motorsport, ultimately, in terms of the FIA's work. So you can't just look at it and say, oh, well, there's countries voting who have hardly any motorsport going on. Why should they ever say, well, they've also got mobility going on? And some of those countries are ones that really need, actually, the help in terms of the mobility side, and also where Mohammed Ben Sulayem has often talked about trying to build up grassroots motorsport and get motorsport popular in those emerging nations. So there are reasons to have systems like this, but this exact system seems a little bit limited. But John, why should F1 fans care about this? Maybe we should have started with that.
Good question.
But obviously, sporting politics is its own weird arena, isn't it? And there'll be some listening thinking, oh, what's this got to do with anything? Do you think it matters fundamentally who the FIA president is?
I think you need a sport. Formula One needs a regulator that it has faith in and belief in and trust in, and that's doing the proper job of policing it. Because if the sport isn't policed properly, then the whole meritocracy falls apart, and it no longer becomes the pure sport that it should be. So I think having a strong, powerful, capable FIA is really, really important for Formula One. And I think for that to happen, then the president does have to be democratically voted in and has the support. And I think it would have been maybe even Mohammed Ben Sulayem would accept this himself. It'd be better for him to have gone to an election against a candidate and then win the vote itself and come out more powerful than to have things decided before the elections even started by having candidates unable to stand against him. I think actually it's much better to come through the election and win it comprehensively, which he probably would have done anyway. I don't think there's any doubt that had it gone to an election, whether it was against just Tim Mayer, whether Laura Villars as well would have stood, whether there would have been 2 people against him or 3 or just 1, I think the likelihood is he would have won anyway. So it would have been healthier and probably better optics as well for it to have gone to an election and then to have come out and said, I've got the support of the clubs. I'm now going forwards with a proper mandate.
You asked whether people should care, Ed. Like, how much does it matter? I feel like for F1 now, it's a bit of a sideshow. I don't think it has the kind of same impact it would have had in the Eccleston-Mosley era, where they were kind of lockstepping, meddling with F1 as much as they can, just kind of deciding how things played out. I feel like in the modern era, it's much more transactional relationship between FOM, Formula One, and the stakeholders who are kind of in charge of everything. And the FIA is the regulator. There's like a separation, and they have tension when Ben Sulayem or whoever the FIA president might be comes in with an over-the-top intervention and says, I want to do this, or I want Formula One to go in this direction. And then they scrabble around and go, well, hang on, we haven't discussed this. So do we really want to do this? It's become quite adversarial. I wonder if in an ideal world, Formula One would actually not have the FIA at all involved. They would just have some kind of new body of very technically minded independent regulators and not rely so much on their own teams to write the rules and police them, because it's felt to me like forever that the FIA has been several steps behind F1's own participants in terms of the full understanding of what's happening and how to regulate it properly. So you've almost got the poachers gamekeeping themselves in Formula One at times. And it's been more and more difficult in this era, I think, for the FIA to retain good ex-F1 people who they need to help regulate the sport. We've seen, the brain drain from the FIA and various people take up roles and then leave them very quickly. That's bad, and it weakens the regulator. I think that's the relationship between the FIA and Formula One is probably weaker than it used to be, and therefore who's running it would make a difference if it strengthened that regulatory aspect. But the way things have been going, I almost feel like F1 would prefer if the FIA just kind of disappeared and they could build up their own regulator from scratch and kind of own the whole thing themselves.
Well, absolutely, they would like that, but also there's reasons why regulators and the commercial side get separated, isn't there? So I actually think it is in F1's. We've got to be careful when we're talking about this, because there's F1 the thing, and then there's F1 the Stefano Domenicali led organisation, and we're talking the latter there. I'm sure they'd love full control over it, but I do think there's a lot to be said for a strong regulator, and that's because what you just said, Ben. It's a very difficult job, and even, John, in terms of that thing of they've been behind the teams, they're always going to be, aren't they? Because the teams are the massed ranks of 10 full F1 budgets who are throwing themselves at the regulations, examining everything, trying to find every little loophole, clever trick, etc., etc. So even if the FIA technical team was a full F1 team, it would still be outgunned, wouldn't it? So it's almost impossible for it to deliver on that. It's always going to be kind of trying to push back the tide when it comes to that.
Yeah, you've got thousands of engineers all around the world trying to break the rule book and try and exploit the grey areas and work their way around it, probing everything, every opportunity against an FIA, then trying to control it, understand it and stay ahead of it. But equally, you've got to think bigger picture as well in terms of the FIA's role. And this was something Nicholas Tombassis, the single-seater director, mentioned when I spoke to him in Singapore about the cooling vest, that drivers, criticising it, saying we don't need it, this is a problem. And he was absolutely firm, saying you can criticise the FIA for, certain decisions about penalties or certain decisions about incidents on track, because we're human, it's human to err, mistakes will be made. But you cannot criticise the FIA for the role it's made in advancing safety and creating a Formula One now with cars racing at 200 miles an hour that is pretty safe. Advances like the Halo, the HANS device. He says even the cooling vest now, that drivers may mock it and think they don't need it because they're super macho and stuff, but there may well be a race in the future where the temperatures are high 30s into the 40s, and without the cooling vest there will be no chance of racing. Drivers will be up in arms. So if this helps avoid in the future one race stopping getting cancelled because of something the FIA is pushing for, then that needs support and praise, not something to be criticised for doing something against the team. So the FIA is always in this tricky role of it needs to have the teams on board, but also there's a bit of push and pull from both sides in terms of teams wanting to exploit regulations, FIA trying to keep them in check, FIA pushing for things that teams don't like or drivers don't like. So it's never an enviable task. And I think the FIA, very rarely does a regulator come out of a Grand Prix weekend and everyone's got thumbs up saying what a brilliant job they did in regulating that weekend, because nobody got caught breaking the regulations and everything was done perfectly. It's often only when decisions are made and there's grey areas that the FIA comes in the spotlight, and more often than not it's because people want to criticise them for having done something and got involved.
Yeah, that's an illustration of why a strong FIA is essential. Now, you can question whether having a system that allows there effectively not to be an election when there's credible candidates potentially standing is up for debate. But yeah, that's what this is all about. And we should say that deadline for the presidential lists, as you said, John, is still open into, I think, next week. So there's the potential for...
Yeah.
There's presumably some potential for resolution or change or whatever, but as it stands, that is the situation. Well, thanks very much, John and Ben, for your insight. We've got the United States Grand Prix coming up now, so stay with us for everything you need to know from Austin.